the title of my sermon, as you can see, is The Blind Man. That story is going to be found in John chapter 9. We just recently went through the whole book of John, and as we were going through it, as with many things, you start noticing different stories that maybe you didn't pay attention to the first time through, or many times through that you've gone through the book. This is one of those stories that I really didn't pay attention to until my lovely wife said, "Hey, this is an interesting story. Why don't you look at it again?" And when you look at the story, it makes an interesting impact in your life if you pay attention to what's actually being shown through the scriptures. You know, to set up this story, you obviously have to know where it takes place and when it takes place. So the where is going to be Jerusalem. And the when is between the Feast of the Tabernacle and before Jesus has his triumphant entry into Jerusalem. If that can kind of put you in a time frame, it's before Jesus enters into Jerusalem officially in the capacity of the triumphal entry. But then prior to that, he was at the Feast of the Tabernacle in Jerusalem. Gives you a little bit of a time frame. I want you to understand the location not only is Jerusalem, but it's the temple of the Jews. This is kind of the layout of what the temple looked like at that time. You have the large space, which is basically called the Gentile court. Anybody and everybody could come to this location, come to this area and be a part. If you wanted to be, if you found yourself a religious type person, you could be here. But then if you notice, there's a wall, a dividing wall right here. You could not go past that if you were not an Israelite or a Jew, or if you were considered unclean. You were not allowed past that. And then you go a little further in, only the priests were allowed in this area. And then you go inside the holy place, only certain ones of the priests were allowed in there. And the reason I bring all this to your attention, it becomes important as we go on within this story. Now, let's go ahead and get started into this story. The blind man, John chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. And as he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or that his parents, but that the work of God might be displayed in him. Having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva, that he anointed the man's eyes with the mud, and said to him, Go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. This is one of the miracles that Jesus performed while he was in Jerusalem. You know, when Jesus performed this miracle, this was a man who spent his time at the temple begging. This was a man who all these people who came to worship knew about. They saw him there begging, and they knew that he was a man that was born blind. Now, the Jews had a tradition that if you were born blind, you must have done something wrong. Or if you had some sort of illness, such as or a disability or something to that effect, your parents or you must have done something to require that sort of punishment from God on you. And that's the mindset of the Jews, and it's just traditional type thinking that they had, that's what caused that sort of thing. Well, this man comes back after going to this pool of Siloam, after Jesus told him to, and comes back, and his neighbors start questioning. They say, okay, are you the guy that was blind? Because you can see now, so you must not be him. And he's over here trying to convince them, yes, I am that man that was blind. Well, few people believed him. The Pharisees even got in on this and started questioning. And again, bring you back to the location. They're in the temple area. So these people, there's Jews here, they're religious Jews, there are Pharisees, there's people all around this man who know who he is, who know what's going on. And they start questioning, are you the blind man? These people don't believe him, to the point that all those Jews, all those people go and find his parents and say, okay, "Is this your son?" John chapter 9, verses 19 through 21, and asked them, "Is this your son whom you say was born blind? How then does he now see?" His parents answered, we know that this is our son, and that he was born blind, but how he now sees, we do not know, nor do we know who opened his eyes. And they say, "Ask him, he is of age, he will speak for himself." Now these parents, to me, find it kind of funny. They say, "Why are you asking us? He's a grown man. Let him answer for himself." We'll get into that a little bit later as to why they say that. Well, the Jews decide that they're going to go ahead and ask him again. And his response to that was, "You've asked me this already. Why are you asking me again? Do you want to be a disciple of the person who healed me?" That was his response. He got a little frustrated with them asking him again, not only are you the one who was healed, but then second to that, who healed you? When he said the words, "Do you want to be the disciple of the man who healed me? Do you want to be his disciples?" They reviled him. The Jews basically did not like that answer, did not want him to say that to them. And what their response, and what he ends up doing, the healed man, he ends up defending Jesus, defending the man who healed him. Now this blind man starts out just saying, "This man Jesus healed me." Then he goes on throughout this progression to be the one that defends Jesus to these Jews. And we're going to read his defense. John chapter 9, verses 30 through 33. The Jews were convinced that this man, whoever healed this blind person, because he did it on the Sabbath, that he was obviously not of God. Because all Jewish people know, of course, the Sabbath is the most important thing to do. So his answer to that was, the man answered, "Why? This is an amazing thing." I just hear the sarcasm in that. This is an amazing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never, since the world began, has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. I want you to understand the power that's defense has in it. This is a man who was a beggar, a blind beggar, and if you really think about it, worth nothing to the community, if you were to really think about it from the religious people's standpoint. And this man has just stood up to the leaders of the Jewish country and said, "You guys are wrong. This man healed me. If this man was not from God, he could do nothing." He has put those people to shame, a person that they would have considered worthless, and defended Christ, defended God. Well, of course, they don't like that. They answered him, "You were born in utter sin, and would you teach us?" And they cast him out. This is the story of this blind man. But there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from this man, and there's 3 that I want to look at this afternoon. The first one, who sinned? That question that the disciples asked Jesus. 2, the works of God. And then 3, ask him. The first one, who sinned? The disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Many times in life we come across a lot of different people with a lot of different backgrounds and a lot of different situations in life. And how many times have you found yourself making this type of judgment about somebody based off of what you know about them? Just because of something you see, you make a decision that they were the ones who sinned or their parents sinned. And you make that decision in and of yourself without knowing the situation, or without knowing the person, or getting to know the person. Now, am I talking about making a true judgment decision based off of a knowledge of the life that a person has led and the steps that have brought them to the location that they're at? No, that is not what I'm speaking of. I'm speaking of somebody that you meet and you make a decision that you know everything about them and everything about their life. based off of that. Matthew 7, verse 1, judge not that you be not judged. Jesus is dealing with that specific sentiment right there. We as Christians should not be that type of person. You know, if you notice, the disciples, when they asked this question, there was no third option. Somebody sinned. The man himself or his parents. There might be some other explanation. It was somebody sinned. One of those two. So who did it? They made a predetermined decision about this man that was born blind, had no control of his situation, had no control of what was going on. Now I want to be clear. I want to be very clear. There are certain instances where you can make that logical distinction and make the true judgment that God calls us to by judging a person by their fruit. And we are called as Christians to make those decisions, make those judgment calls. But we need to be careful, very careful, that we don't overstep our liberties as Christians on those judgments. That we don't take it so far that we make a determined decision about a person based off of what's happened in their life and what you know about them, and you make that decision without truly understanding their life, truly understanding them. You know, James also addresses this issue. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 9. This is where James is talking to the churches, and he says, God is not a respecter of persons, and neither should we be. He talks about a rich man coming into the assembly, and some people go to him and oh yeah, why don't you sit up here in the front and let's pay attention to this man, a rich man. Make sure we're taking care of this guy. But then a poor man walks in. And in our lingo, person kind of raggedy walks in. Maybe not dressed the way we want them to dress to come to church. Maybe not talking the way we would want them to talk. God is not a respecter of persons. We need to be careful about how we deal with our fellow man. You know what it really comes down to? James chapter 2, verse 8. If you really fulfill the royal law according to the scriptures, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. You are doing well. James says if you're going to do anything, love your neighbor as yourself. If you're doing that, you're doing it right. You're doing what you're supposed to be doing. The question shouldn't be who sinned, whose fault is it, what happened. It should be how can I help? What can we do? What can we do to exist in unity and love with each other? The works of God. John chapter 9, verse 3, Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned nor that his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. You know, Ty likes to say this. It annoys me to death when he does it sometimes. But he likes to say this. He says, L-I-F-E. Life happens. Things happen in life that we cannot control. This man could not control the fact that he was born blind. His parents couldn't control the fact that this man was born blind. It was a circumstance that could not be controlled. Ecclesiastes 9, verses 11. Again, I saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor the bread to the wise, nor the riches to the intelligent, nor favor to those who with knowledge, but time and chance happen to them all. Things happen in life. Situations will happen. Tragedy may strike your life. Things may happen to you. Things may happen to friends you know that they can't control. How do you respond? How do you respond when those things happen? Now, there's a dear person in our lives. We all have people that we know that deal with things that they had no control over. But have you thought about that situation and thought, I'm going to think about this and I'm going to treat it in a way that I'm going to let the works of God show through my life in these situations. I'm going to let the works of God show. The whole purpose, what Jesus said, the purpose of what happened to this man, him being born blind, was so that the works of God might be displayed. That was the purpose for what happened. Sometimes things happen in your life, but the purpose may be for you to show the world what it really means to be a Christian and show God's work in your life. That may be the purpose for you going through that tragedy. That may be the purpose for you dealing with those situations, because God wants you to show the world what it means to be a Christian and how to deal with things. Do you live your life this way, to where you commit your ways to the Lord and trust in Him and He will act? Do you live your life that way, to where when a tragedy hits you and square between the eyes and you don't know what to do, you do that? You focus and you trust God. James 1 verses 2 through 3, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. Things happen in your life that are trials of different sorts. We have people who have health issues in this congregation. We have people who have financial issues in this congregation. We have people with marital issues in this congregation. How do you deal with those things? How do you respond when you have those things happen in your life? Is it to throw your hands up and say, I can't do this. Life is too hard. I don't know what to do. I'm just going to throw my hands up and give up. Or do you turn to the Lord and show that the works of God may be displayed in your life? How do you respond? This blind man really had no any say-so on whether Jesus noticed him or not. But you know what he did have a say-so in? Whether he went to the pool of Siloam to wash. He could have said, I don't believe that Jesus can actually heal me by putting a little mud on me. It's a little unsanitary. That's actually what I think. He spit on me. That's not what this man did. He trusted Jesus. He trusted that God was going to do what He promised. Works of God. And lastly is ask Him. John chapter 9 verse 21, but how He now sees we do not know, nor do we know who opened His eyes. Ask Him, He is of age. He will speak for Himself. I told you we were going to talk about why his parents said this. The parents of this man are kind of, in my opinion, throw him under the bus a little bit. They don't want to deal with this situation because they feared the Jews. They feared the people that they were a part of. His parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. His parents were looking out for themselves. They didn't want to be excommunicated, if you will, from the Jewish people, from the synagogue. They wanted to still be able to worship there. If they had said, yes, we know that Jesus is the one who healed him. He healed him, so he must be the Christ. If they had said anything to that effect, they would have been cut off from the synagogue. But what they did was say, you know what? Ask him. He's of age. He's old enough. Anything that he says is on him. It has no reflection on me whatsoever as his parent. At some point, you get to stop riding your parents' coattails. At some point, you need to defend your own faith. I want you to go back to this temple. I want you to remember the fact that I said that only Gentiles were allowed, or Gentiles were only allowed here in the court of the Gentiles, and that unclean people were only allowed there. A blind person was allowed a little bit closer. They were allowed a little bit closer. They could, so I'm going to show you again. If you're looking at the picture over there on your right, That's the entire assembly. That's the entire area of the temple. Okay? The picture over here on the left, that one is just basically the enclosed area right here. If I can show you right here. That's what that is. Okay? This layout shows you that there's a court, an outer court. There's basically inner court hall of the Israelites and the priests, that kind of thing. And then beyond that, that's the priest area. That's where they did all of their work. Okay? As a blind man, he was allowed to this point right here, the outer court. As a Jew, he would have been allowed up to that point. But you know, when the Jews were to give their sacrifices every year, or when they were supposed to present their sacrifices to the Lord, what was supposed to happen was that a Jew, when he brought his sacrifice into the temple, was supposed to pass through this barrier right here and come up to this location, the hall of the Israelites, and watch their sacrifice being given up to God, and actually see that happen. This man wasn't allowed past that point. So when his offerings, if he gave offerings, that is one assumption I am making, I'll say that right now. But if he was to give an offering, he wasn't allowed to watch it go before the Lord. He wasn't allowed to come before the Lord with his sacrifice. For his entire existence, he was not allowed. The Jews excluded blind, the deaf, the lame, people who had blemishes of that nature were excluded from being in front of the Lord in that situation. They could be in the outer court and in the court of the Gentiles where everybody else could be, but they could not pass that barrier. Now I want you to understand, this man was healed of his illness, of his blindness. I would like for you to extrapolate what that means for this man. He has now been given the opportunity to watch his sacrifice go up to God. He has now been allowed the opportunity to become a part of the Jewish culture, part of the worship to God. Puts a little bit more meaning to defending his faith, to defending Jesus, when his parents wouldn't even defend him because they knew if they claimed that Jesus was Christ, that they would be kicked out of the temple, that they would be kicked out of the synagogue. And this man, the same day that he was allowed the access to this temple, the same day he said, no, I'm going to defend Jesus. I'm going to defend the man who healed me. As Christians today, at some point, you must defend your faith. Acts chapter 22, verse 1, brothers and fathers, hear the defense I now make before you. This is Paul speaking. We just read Acts chapter 21 last Wednesday. This is where Paul is standing at the very beginning of 22. He's standing before all these Jews, and he's saying, hear the defense that I'm going to make before you. These are people who are trying to kill him, and he says, I'm going to make a defense for his faith. At some point, as a Christian, we must defend our faith. At some point, you must not be ashamed of your testimony. You know, this man could have very easily said, I'm not that blind man. I don't know who that was. I'm sure glad I'm not him. He wasn't ashamed of where he came from and where he was. Now, am I saying that you should be proud of where you came from? In a sense of, I'm proud that I came from this life that I was living before. Now, you know, I'm proud of that. Or are you proud of the fact that you changed? At some point, you must not be afraid of using your testimony to bring others to Christ. Not only are you defending your faith, but you're using your life as a way to defend that faith. You know, Paul is, and again, Acts chapter 22, which we'll read this Wednesday, you will hear that Paul is not sugarcoating anything when it comes to what he did before he became a Christian. He laid it out there for those Jews. He was not afraid of showing where he came from and where it led him. Are you afraid of sharing your testimony because you're afraid of what people may think about you? You may have an excellent testimony in the sense of you may have a family who spent every moment and every day, every available opportunity at church. That is a testimony to have. That's a testimony of a good parentage. That's a testimony of what it takes to, even when maybe you get a little bored, you still are there and you do what you need to do. That's what that testimony is. Maybe you come from a testimony of you lived a life that you didn't need to live. You can have that testimony as well. And you can show this is where you don't want to be and this is where you should be. Are you afraid to share that? I hope not, because that's what it's going to take as Christians to be able to impact the people around us, is to be able to share what God did for you. It's all great in the theoretical, but what did he do for you? How did he impact you? What has it changed in your life? Don't be ashamed. Therefore, do not be ashamed of the testimony of our Lord, nor of me his prisoner, but share in the suffering for the gospel by the power of God. Don't be ashamed. Live your life accepting where you came from and pointing to where you are. At some point, you must decide who you will worship. At some point, you're going to come to that realization that you can choose to do what everybody else has done. And I'm talking about in the Jewish world and going back to that man. Do what everybody else has done. And, I'm going to go back to that and say, I don't know who healed him. I don't know. I'm going to be able to keep worshiping with everybody here, but I don't know. Or you can choose to make your stand and choose who you will worship. John chapter 9, verses 35 through 38, Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and having found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "And who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you." He said, "Lord, I believe," and worshiped him. At the end of this story, at the end of this, what happened here, this man followed and worshiped Jesus because of the impact that Jesus had in his life. John spends an entire chapter talking about this man. Spends an entire chapter talking about what happened here. I think we would do well to pay attention to what's going on. But at the end of this story, I believe, Lord, I believe, and he worshiped him. At the end of this story, that's what matters. All the other things that we talked about lead to this. All the other things we talked about come back to this. However you want to look at it. I hope that what I've talked to you about this afternoon has been something to impact you. Something to make you think about your life as a Christian, make you think about the way you are living your Christian life. And also to give you some knowledge, something to learn about the blind man that's spoken about in John chapter 9. And I hope that you've learned something this afternoon.